The past and future of the Gullah Geechee community is the topic of our conversation today. Two experts join me to discuss an upcoming cultural celebration. Plus, a local bankruptcy judge works to stem the flow of veterans in financial crisis. And later, we're joined in studio by Jacksonville Renaissance artist Jennifer Chase. But first, thousands of acres of coastline and sea islands stretching between North Carolina and Florida are home to the Gullah Geechee Nation. I'm joined by two people who can trace their lineage to the Gullah Geechee ancestors and are working to preserve the culture. Documentary filmmaker Derek Hankerson helps produce an annual festival celebrating the community's history and traces his lineage to the Gullah Geechee people. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Saundra, Morene, president of the Jacksonville Gullah Geechee Nation Community Development Corporation, and also a descendant of this historic community. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
To our listeners, what do you know about the Gullah Geechee people? Were you ever taught about this historic community's roots in Florida and Georgia? Give us a call at 549-2937. Tag us on X at FCC On Air or send an email to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. You can also message us on the First Coast Connect Facebook and Instagram pages. Saundra, Morene, begin by telling those who may not know a brief history of the Gullah Geechee people. Who are they?
Gullah Geechee people are descendants from West and Central Africa. They're also descendants from individuals who were on this land prior to colonization. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor spans from North Carolina, the Cape Fear River, to St. Augustine, Florida, the St. Johns River. It is 12,315 square miles of endangered cultural heritage for those who were enslaved and isolated on some 80 barrier islands, which extend into the Atlantic Ocean. This is home to approximately 5 million people. Jacksonville, as we know it, is the home of the largest population of Gullah Geechee descendants.
Okay. And the history of those people, those enslaved people, came primarily from West Africa. Is that correct?
The literature suggests that they primarily came from West and Central. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so the population were originally working on plantations, rice and indigo. Is that correct? Kind of in that area?
So when we begin to speak of Gullah Geechee people, we are generally infusing the language of Gullah Geechee, which is a newly designated, Gullah/Geechee is newly designated by the United States government to interpret the life and history of a group of people who were enslaved and who lived within the boundaries of that 30-mile inland and who still hold most of the Afrocentric cultural heritage traits that's in cooking, language, and in actions. So basically, when you speak of Gullah Geechee people, you always think of them as being in the quarter, but Gullah Geechee people are actually global. They are all over the United States because of enslavement and emancipation. They moved, and with them, the culture moved. We are primarily today giving information about the individuals that are still domiciled within that 30-mile inland stretch.
Derek Hankerson, a little later we're going to talk about an upcoming festival in Armstrong, which is inland St. Johns County, kind of near Elkton. But start by telling us your family's connection to Armstrong and the Gullah Geechee community.
My paternal grandmother was West African. My maternal great-great-grandfather was West African. His profession was farming. His profession was farming because West and Central Africans were experts with reference to agriculture, horticulture, silviculture, husbandry, and hence why the millions of West and Central Africans who were imported to the New World to help settle the New World because of their expertise. We were talking earlier in your promo about the Jacksonville Jags. For any professional team who is looking to make it to the championship, you do not recruit your weakest players. You recruit your best players. Those best players who were West Africans, as Saundra was explaining, helped settle the Sea Islands. They formed some of the first militias in the territory of La Florida, which is now a state, and it dates back to 1513. With reference to the specific question, after the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Order Number 15. Order Number 15 confiscated 400,000 acres of Confederate land, 30 miles inland, and it started in the Carolinas, and it came down the St. Johns County River and ended in what is now St. Johns County. President Abraham Lincoln signed Order Number 15 in the field, in the military field, 4 days later. That policy lasted a year, and what it did was it allowed for those newly freed slaves to acquire 40 acres and a mule. Two communities in the exceptional county of St. John's, which was one of the first counties established in Florida. The other is Escambia, was established July 1st, 1821. The two areas that were created after the Civil War were Lincolnville, which was originally named it was originally named West Africa. It was settled in 1866. Armstrong was settled in 1889. Those two communities were settled by my relatives. More specifically, Armstrong was settled by my grandmother's people, great-grandmother, and so on and so forth, and hence we were able to connect the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor to St. Johns County through a management plan because the United States Department of Interior left out St. Augustine and St. Johns County. When those newly freed slaves were looking for freedom, they would not have stopped in Calford. That was the name of Jacksonville prior to Andrew Jackson. They would have come to the Spanish capital, which is St. Augustine, and they acquired their freedom. The policy only lasted a year because President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. His vice president, Andrew Jackson, was a segregationist. He acquired the 400,000 acres back. So the only people who were able to benefit from that policy over a year was the exceptional community of St. John's, Armstrong, and Lincolnville.
And so, Saundra, this corridor, you said it's a 12,000 mile. It stretches from, I believe, Pender, North Carolina, down into St. Johns County, about 35 miles inland. It was designated by an act of Congress
Correct.
in 2006.
Yes.
And so preserving this area is a large task. It's a large area. In a recent interview with NBC, Akua Page, who's a Gullah Geechee tour guide in Charleston, South Carolina, talked about one particular aspect of preserving Gullah Geechee culture, and that was the language. Let's hear a little bit about what she had to say, and then I'd like to talk to you about that.
If I was to greet y'all in Gullah, I would say how Hana for do or how Yena for do. But if I was to greet you in Geechee, I'd just be like, what's going on? I feel like it's our duty to tell our ancestors' story. You know, going back to that African proverb, you know, until the lion tells their tale, the story of the hunt is always going to glorify the hunter. So I feel like, you know, I'm that lioness. You know, I'm going to tell the story of my ancestors.
Saundra, talk about the language, the Gullah language, the Geechee language, and how it's distinct.
Well, I can tell you, I spoke Gullah until I was about 6. I had to be taught to speak English because my grandmother, who was my caregiver, gave me all of my lessons of words in Gullah. So I called every animal a Gullah name, and when it was time for me to go to school, my sister, who was in speech, had to reprogram my tongue in order to speak English. So there is a story that moves with the cultural components of the man. That is, as they move through the land. After emancipation, many people moved to areas where there were work. And a lot of South Carolinians moved to Jacksonville because we had work in Jacksonville. The train system, the steel mill, um, uh, employment. There were quarters all around where railroads were being
And
made.
where were you raised?
I was raised 1407 Franklin Street, right in front of Matthew Gilbert, but my grandmother lived right across the tracks on Phillips and Emerson, which that community is still there. So that community was established by USCT, the colored troops who got out of the Civil War and began to establish that Emerson Pine Forest community. So getting back to your question about the language, it is not necessarily location. It moves with the individual, and there are different components of the language that definitely move. So it's integrated, and as we learn more about the Gullah Geechee, which is that new designation, we're able to then interpret some of the movement of people, that in total diaspora, the language, the Afro-Creole language, the Afro-Seminole language, all of those languages are placed in a melting pot. And when you come out with what you hear, there's going to be some distinctive characteristics. I just took a trip across country and I paid close attention to the language. We had people in Louisiana who sound like they were from Georgia. So basically, as the enslaved moved on plantations, that language still stayed with those who were isolated, and then it moved. So after emancipation, during the time of Reconstruction, there was a big melting of culture because we were no longer in someone else's kitchen. We were in our own. So we were in our own confines with family, and we established, and the culture had the language evolve, which means Jacksonville today may not speak the same language as South Carolinians. We can understand it because most of us have heard it. We've grown up around it.
And that recording we played is familiar to you?
Oh yeah, I could understand it. I could understand everything. So most people who heard it, I'm sure Derek can understand it as well. And it's an amazing feat to just see and hear how the language itself shows the culture and just exactly how it moved.
So preserving the language of this culture is one challenge. And it's not just about language, though. There's other elements of the culture that are at risk, and land is a big part of that.
Huge part.
So I want to just brief our listeners. So we're talking about 8 million acres of land, and a lot of that land has become resort developments. Jekyll Island,
Yes.
St. Simon's Island,
Yes.
Cumberland. Hilton Head is perhaps one of the most famous
Yes.
resort islands that used to be Gullah Geechee land.
Yes.
Talk to me about the challenges that land itself presents, and then I want to play a little sound from an interview in a moment with an attorney that's working to preserve the land.
I'll do this briefly and quickly. A lot of, if not all of the land was heired property. Unfortunately, there were not a lot of titles on that land. There was not a lot of taxes paid on that land. And if you have no title and no taxes, you can find attorneys who are savvy enough to work around the legal system to acquire what it is they want to acquire. And that is literally what has and is happening.
Let's hear a little sound from him, and then we'll circle back. This is Gullah attorney Willie Hayward talking about his efforts to preserve the land.
When the ancestors acquired it, this was not a very desirable place to live because of the lack of air conditioning, mosquitoes, alligators, and lack of access, lack of bridges and so on and so forth, and roads. But now that it's changed, so that progress, for lack of a better word, has brought in folks who now want to divest Gullah Geechee people of that land for development purposes.
So some of that land is now really some of the most valuable property in the states that are part of that corridor.
It is the most valuable land. Let's think back to as Saundra was saying, let's think back to the 18th and 19th century. With water comes what? Mosquitoes. So no one would want to live near a mosquito-infested area. And the only people who could survive those mosquito-infested areas are West and Central African who have built up immunity to prevent them from acquiring or getting malaria and yellow fever. And hence why West and Central Africans were the staple of people who helped this exceptional nation become what it is. Without the strength of these people, of us, no one would have survived. And there were slaves and indentured servants and everything else prior to that time, but they died. They died because the South was nothing but a swamp. So for this exceptional experiment to have succeeded, you needed the strongest of people. Those strongest of peoples were West and Central Africans who could survive. And so they lived on the barrier islands. And now, because of the interview that you just played, people want to do what? Live on the ocean. They want to build multi-million-dollar mansions on the ocean. And that was our family's former property.
Saundra, talk about that. This is a issue that the loss of that land has really impacted the ability of the Gullah Geechee people and the Gullah Geechee nation to derive the benefits of the value of that land.
That's true. It's amazing that Gullah Geechee people can own large parcels of land for long periods of time, but they are unable to get the necessary dollars to develop those lands themselves. When the investors come in to purchase the land, they use all kind of tactics in order to do that, and some are legal, some are not. However, we have very little recourse. Sometimes the taxes go up, the individuals who are on the property are unable to pay. That heirs property portal is something that we're looking very strongly with right now. In fact, we do have an initiative right now in Jacksonville to help people maintain their land. So South Carolina and the larger deep water lands is not the only place where Gullah Geechee descendants are actually losing their economic stand. In our communities right now in the city of Jacksonville, we have more rentals in our areas because of loss of property due to taxes, or heirs property due to taxes or taxation on individuals who are unable to pay, who are economically unsound.
So the issue of preserving culture in some ways is aided by isolation. And in a recent interview, Queen Quet, who is the founder of the Gullah Geechee Sea Island Coalition, she lives in St. Helena Island, which is about midway between Charleston and Savannah. Gives you an idea of kind of the communities there, how they've developed, how wealthy and prosperous they are, that are benefiting people that own them now. And she was asked about the isolation of the area and kind of how that contributed to the culture and also its risks to development. So let's hear a little bit of that.
We're insulated and kind of kept warmed and keep our culture alive away from the mainland culture. Folks come in with bulldozers, and the first thing we see is they want to dig up what we've already had for all these generations, and then they want to build something that's antithetical to our culture.
Talk about that, Derek. What is antithetical about development, and how is it that the kind of low-density development that has defined the Gullah Geechee Nation contributes to their heritage?
Traditionally, if you look at any farming families, mine included, you would find that they would live in very modest homes, and their land is the wealth. They would not build houses that are 5, 10, 15,000 square feet. And the opportunity to farm your own land, to grow your own food, so to reduce high blood pressure, to reduce high cholesterol. If you were feeding yourself and your family, that would fit within the confines of the culture, to include, we would eat a lot of the crustacean and fish from the various different waterways, and that is what made our unique food. And without that, there is no food. There is no Southern food. There is no soul food. And food is one of many of the staples of the Gullah Geechee culture.
We have a call right now from Stanley on the north side. Good morning, Stanley, and welcome to First Coast Connect. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Stanley Scott here with the African American Economic Recovery Think Tank. I'm a native of Gullah Geechee. My father's from Edisto Island, South Carolina. First of all, Africans have been here over 15,000 years. We come from the north, and then we came down to the south. Now, number two is the seafood from the Gullah Geechee community. We the one created that. Number three here, one of the reasons why the Gullah Geechee community is not moving forward because they are not organized, especially in Jacksonville, Florida. Thank you.
Thank you, Stanley.
May I address his point?
Certainly.
He's absolutely correct. The unique history of Florida dating back 500 years, because we know Florida was settled in 1513. If anyone looks at a world map, you'll see Spain is here, Africa is here, and Portugal is over here. We have to remember that North Africans or Moors ruled Spain for 700 years, from 711 to 1492. 1492, Christopher Columbus explored, right? That opened up the age of exploration. So our families moved from the age of exploration to La Florida. Starting in 1513, Spanish brought with them free and enslaved Africans, starting in 1513. And in fact, 1513, there were two free Africans who were on the ship. Juan Guillardo, who introduced wheat to the New World, and Juan Gonzalez. In 1565, my hometown of St. Augustine was established with 800 Spanish. On that ship, between 40 and 60 free and enslaved Africans traveled. So he's absolutely correct. With reference to Florida, we have been in Florida over 500 years, and in St. Augustine for over 450 years. It's not about feelings. These are the facts.
So let's talk a little bit about the traditions that you're working to preserve. Saundra, I know that one thing that you are a part of promoting is Watch Night, also known as Freedom's Eve. Tell people what that is and when it's celebrated and why.
Watch Night is New Year's Eve. December 31st, and it is celebrated each year. This year we will do a celebration at 12 noon Sunday, December 31st at Mount Zion AME Church, historic Mount Zion in downtown Jacksonville. The program itself will give education to the components of emancipation, Reconstruction, civil rights. I mean, we will give a full Florida history as it relates to the Native American occupation. We'll take a deep dive into the history of Jacksonville. We still have mounds here that have been archaeologically confined and taught in a lot of classrooms that are 2,500 years old. You know, we still have those mounds still standing. So
Explain
there's a
what
lot.
Watch Night celebrates.
So the Watch Night celebration will come in, and it will bring in the components of that ancestral lineage that we have. It is a ceremony that is practiced every year in churches all over, and it actually has a caller. It has watchmen. It has beautiful music. The components of Watch Night brings the spiritual confines of those who are there together and those who are in the age we have now, social media, who are present, are able to take a dive into what slavery did and the components of freedom. And that is what this year's Watch Night service will bring.
And to be clear, Watch Night is a reference to the night or the nights as people were waiting to hear the news of the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. And Watch Night actually brings to the light the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation, which took place on January 1, 1861. That is prior to the Civil War. And just everyone converged on the reading of that document. And because it was said that if they were not present, they would not be free. The document itself, we know, only was effective and held an order of writ for those states that had seceded from the Union if they had slaves. If they were within the Union and they had slaves, those slaves were not free. So we have to go back and do a lot of education on the components of Watch Night, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, and just how things moved into Reconstruction after the Civil War was over. So Watch Night service is what we're talking about, and Watch Night service is that ceremony that brings all of this together. It's practiced each year to reinforce our call for freedom, our continual emancipation as we do it daily.
And Derek, you're also a promoter and a producer of an event in St. Augustine, an annual event. I think we're going to have the 10th coming up. Tell us what is happening in Armstrong, I believe.
Well, let me first give you the backstory, and then I will address that if I may. I'll do it quickly. In 2012, I had the pleasure of hosting the National Park Service's Network to Freedom Project. And we did that because of the fact that I convinced the Department of Interior and National Park Service that while, again, facts, not feelings, while the Underground Railroad did go north to Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Canada, it actually came south to Spanish Florida starting in about 1620. So we were able to get the National Park Service and the United States Department of Interior to realize that they left out information. After that point in time, we were able to reach out to the Florida Channel. We produced a film in 2012, which is entitled The Florida Channel Southern Route to Freedom. Immediately after that, I started working with the United States Department of Interior to correct the management plan, which came from the piece of legislation in 2006, which was sponsored by Congressman James Cleburne from South Carolina, which designated the corridor. The corridor left out St. Johns County. So working with Saundra and others who were upset with me because of the fact that they had to redo the management plan, but it was wrong. So the Department of Interior held public meetings. Long story short, they changed the management plan thanks to my work to include St. Johns County. After that was done, we started holding festivals in Armstrong 10 years ago. We held festivals in Armstrong because Armstrong and Lincolnville was now designated as part of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. And so from there, we had a number of bike trails, 3 cycling trails, Sea Island Loop, Rails to Trails, and the East Coast Greenway. The East Coast Greenway is the longest cycling trail in the U.S. Calais, Maine, all the way down the Key West. Armstrong was right in the mix, and thankfully our former county commissioners in St. John's saw the vision with reference to creating these trails. We connected the trails to Armstrong. We started holding festivals 10 years ago. I was one of the grant writers. We wrote a number of different grants to St. Johns County Cultural Council, St. Johns County Tourist Development Council, and Visit Florida. We were awarded resources to put on the grant. That was 10 years ago. Fast forward to today, St. John's Cultural Council picked up the festival a couple of years ago, and we went from hosting 400 to 500 people to last year we had some 4,000 people, and this year, thanks to the exceptional county of St. John's, thanks to the wonderful employees of the St. John's Cultural Council and the TDC of St. Johns County, we're hoping to have 10,000 people this year.
That festival is Saturday, December 2nd. It's from noon to 5 p.m. It's the 10th annual Gullah Geechee Heritage Festival.
Yes.
And it is at Armstrong Park, which is in Elkton, Florida at 4950 Harvey Avenue. I'd like to thank my guests so much. Saundra Morene, thank you so much for being here.
Thank
Derek
you.
Hankerson, thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.